You guys had enough coffee? Should we? The coffee machine is awfully far away, isn't it? I prefer to be a lot closer. Okay, then I'll hand you over to Bradley Kuhn talking about GPL compliance. Thank you.
If by show of hands, how many of you were at the OpenWrt Summit 2 years ago in Berlin and saw my talk there? Okay, so it's less than half the audience. I guess I should have sent out email to tell you that that talk was a prerequisite for this one. So if you're slightly lost, that's okay. It's online, and I'll try to explain as I go through why that talk is a prerequisite. Previously, I spoke, as I said, 2 years ago, and I spoke then mostly about the history of GPL enforcement and how copyleft has worked through the period that is existed, which overlaps heavily with the history of OpenWrt. In fact, I think OpenWrt is probably the most central project in the history of the GPL, for mainly this reason. And for those of you that were here 2 years ago, you remember I had this exact slide. In fact, this is still basically a daily inspiration to me, that a GPL enforcement action not just got source code released, which was required under the GPL, but that source code became the foundation for the project that so many of you work on today. That hasn't happened that often in the history of GPL, in part because GPL violations, the failure to provide the source code that the GPL requires that you provide, have become worse in the many years since OpenWrt. And as I talked about 2 years ago, I still wonder if we made mistakes in how we handled the OpenWrt, or I'm sorry, the WRT54G enforcement. I wonder, probably on a weekly basis, if somebody should have sued Broadcom to require them in the, I guess 2003, to release the wireless driver. Because what that created when everyone backed off, so there was a coalition, as I talked about 2 years ago, of GPL enforcement folks. I was then at the FSF. I work for another organization called the Software Freedom Conservancy now. Harold Velta, Eric Anderson of the BusyBox project, all together enforced against Linksys to get the source code released, but we all decided to back off when Broadcom refused to release their wireless driver. And I actually think that occasionally, I'm going to talk about this more in a few minutes, that lawsuits are necessary. By the way, I'm not, Kathy said earlier I was a lawyer, which I'm not. I actually have a master's degree in computer science, and I used to be a developer, but I've spent a lot of time around lawyers, so I fear that I've somehow ended up sounding like one. So I hope you'll forgive me for that, but I would actually like to be a developer more than doing this kind of policy stuff, but I think this kind of stuff is very essential. We're in an era now where the GPL is strangely not very popular, and GPL violations are more common and more prevalent than they ever have been, but in the recent years since I last spoke to you, GPL enforcement, actually going to companies and saying, well, you do have obligations under this license, you do have source code that you have to release, that's become strangely an incredibly divisive issue, which is somewhat surprising given history, but it's not all that surprising given current politics. In fact, just 2 months after I gave the talk I gave 2 years ago at the OpenWrt Summit, there was basically a political ambush mounted on a Linux kernel mailing list called K-Summit Discuss, which those of you who work upstream on Linux, you're probably used to these kind of political ambushes that happen from time to time on mailing lists. But a huge threat erupted just on the notion that we might have a session at the kernel summit to discuss GPL enforcement. There's this huge argument about whether GPL enforcement should exist at all. And therefore, if it shouldn't exist at all, the kernel community should never talk about it. David Woodhouse, I think, asked the most interesting question during that thread, which is the status quo, he says, is GPL is widely violated. Most copies of Linux that are running today on the billions of Android devices out there, lots of wireless routers, lots of television sets, all sorts of IoT devices, the default you don't get the source code, even though Linux's license requires it. So David asked this, and Greg, who second in command now, or briefly first in command of Linux while Linus was off solving all his abuse problems in 1 month, impressive. Greg answers, Greg wants people to comply with the GPL, but he believes that not only lawsuits are never needed, but that in fact they've never been needed. Well, I don't think that matches the history, at least the history that I know. We've been doing GPL enforcement in our community since the late 1990s, on Linux since the early 2000s, and in fact, I think the reason Linux has been successful in the embedded industry, and when it was its rise in embedded software development, was during the period of the strongest GPL enforcement ever done in history. OpenWrt is just really one example of that. There were actually a lot of lawsuits about lots of generic and various different types of wireless routers brought by this guy. So if you look at the period from 2004 to 2013, Harold brings more than 15 GPL enforcement actions. And I'm told that this is just the ones that are publicly documented. There were probably dozens, if not 30 or 40 more that he did that he never publicized. And most of them were lawsuits. And many of them were against wireless router makers. Apparently on this system, it's running off the end of the screen. There's about another 10 down there. And about half or more are, in fact, wireless router vendors that Harold brought these GPL enforcement actions against. And my guess would be, you can tell me more as OpenWrt developers than I would know, but my guess would be that those code releases that Harold got over those years became essential to porting OpenWrt to that hardware. When there was violations on that hardware, you could actually port to it if Harold in those days got a source release. Now, there's this interesting idea in GPL enforcement critique theory that code doesn't come back upstream. And there's kind of this obsession in projects like BusyBox and Linux and others that I've worked with over the years to do GPL enforcement, that what they want is upstreamable code. And that they had this sense that what GPL was supposed to yield was code upstream. Now, I never actually believed this was the case. And I spoke to Rob Landley, who made that remark about a year and a half ago at LinuxConf Australia, and I think we cleared up a misunderstanding that we apparently had all the years we were working together on enforcement that we never properly cleared up. In fact, the GPL isn't designed as an upstreamable code license. In fact, it doesn't even require that you give changes back to upstream at all. The requirement of GPL is that the person you give the software to also has to receive the source code, which may or may not be the upstream developer. You're not guaranteed as an upstream developer changes back. In fact, the OSI and FSF have rejected licenses that had a mandate of patches back to a specific party. The primary goal of GPL has always been the rights of downstream users, the rights of people who get devices, who get distributions of GPL software and want to hack on it, want to modify it. This has always been in the GPL, although many people aren't aware of it. It's always been the case the GPL just doesn't require the source code for everything. Everything's a derivative work or a combined work with the GPL code. But it requires the material that you needed to get it to build and install. Now, for a project like OpenWrt, this is probably the most interesting part. Because the goal of your project is to make OpenWrt, at least I believe one of the goals of your project, is to make OpenWrt work on as many different hardware platforms as possible. If that's your goal, then you need to know how to install it on those platforms. You probably, especially if it's a GPL violating wireless router company, not one that would join the community, but one that's gone off and done their own thing and not been participating in OpenWrt, they're not likely to make any interesting modifications. They're probably buying off-the-shelf components and putting them in, components that you've probably already made work before. But the confusion and difficulty might be trying to install an updated firmware on that device. Well, the GPL requires that you be told how to install a modified firmware onto the device. And if you don't tell the user who buys the device how to do it, you're in violation of the GPL. V2. This is V2, right there. Scripts used to control installation of the executable, right there. So, oh, this was supposed to be in a smaller font. Sorry about that. So in that conversation, Matthew Garrett raised this really interesting point, which is running off the screen, unfortunately. But his point was basically that what Linux tends to get upstream is things from large companies, things that large companies want to invest in upstream into Linux to run servers and run other types of large industrial hardware. A lot of people, though, got involved in Linux, got involved in open source and free software altogether was because they wanted to hack on their own devices. And this is the kind of project OpenWrt is that I think Matthew was thinking about in that. In fact, I think we've had a lot of the success we've had because there have been many lawsuits regularly since 2002. I think upholding the license and making sure the rules are followed is really, really essential. In the end, if you are a company that's going to contribute upstream, you're not going to care whether it's under GPL or BSD or the Apache license. You're finding other beneficial reasons to contribute to the community. It's only, as we've discovered in the last few years, companies that absolutely refuse to cooperate with the community that are the most danger, and the ones where GPL is most needed. And occasionally, lawsuits are going to be necessary. Now, we can't go back in time and run a parallel experiment and see, well, what if we have never brought any lawsuits ever in the GPL? What if we never even enforced it? What if it had just been a hopeful thing that we put out there and said, we hope people will comply with this, but we're not going to actually try to get anyone who fails to do so to correct their behavior? I didn't have that world. We had this world where GPL enforcement was happening throughout the history of embedded electronics and IoT, and it has created something that I think is valuable. So there's lots of political FUD out there that says, well, we don't need GPL enforcement. We never needed GPL enforcement. And that doing GPL enforcement now would somehow endanger the future of Linux. I don't think that's true, because I don't think OpenWrt would even exist if we didn't do GPL enforcement, at least not in its current form. And I don't think we'd have the things that we've gotten released for embedded hardware, wireless routers in particular, but generally IoT hardware, if we didn't enforce the GPL. Because in the end, what we've seen over the last 20 years is that the smaller the device that has Linux in it, the more likely it's going to be violating the GPL for a variety of reasons, which I'm happy to talk about during Q&A. So if GPL enforcement endangers Linux, it's been endangered since 2002, and your project is part of its endangerment. I don't think that's the case, but that's how the political rhetoric now goes. So we published these principles, and I apologize again for the formatting that's supposed to be in a smaller font, but these are online as well. So one of the things we did at Software Freedom Conservancy was we wanted to explain what GPL was trying to accomplish, or what GPL enforcement was trying to accomplish. Obviously, the GPL itself doesn't have an outline of how enforcement should be done. So what we did is we published these principles of what we call community-oriented GPL enforcement and what types of behaviors should be considered reasonable in the enforcement of GPL. And obviously, the most important one is that legal action of any kind should always be a last resort. The goal is to convince a company to comply, to teach them how to comply, to work with them to properly release the code that they were supposed to release in the first place. And if that fails, if a friendly conversation over a period of years fails, only then would legal action be appropriate. The interesting thing is this kind of friendly conversation typically goes on for years. It's relatively uncommon now for a GPL enforcement action to resolve in quicker than 18 months to 2 years. Now that, from my point of view, is way too long of a time, particularly in the IoT space where devices are turning over as far as architectures and details of how they're built every year and a half at a maximum. We're often having situations where we only get projects into compliance or products into compliance after their end of life. So it's this weird thing where you can violate the GPL, then stall, not come into compliance because we on our side are treating the company as nicely as we can, and then actually never come into compliance in a real way on that product simply because it's EOL'd before there's ever source code available. This is why I think legal action has to be on the table, because it's the only way to get companies who are truly bad actors to do the right thing. You can go read that K-Summit Discuss thread and get a sense of what the hot political debate has been over the last 2 years in GPL enforcement. The interesting thing is that there's not actually as much disagreement as there seems to be. The fact of the matter is Greg and I, who seem, particularly if you read that thread, to be in the highest amount of disagreement about GPL enforcement, we're differing only on the minor point of whether lawsuits should ever be brought. I had this interesting conversation with Greg once where I said to him, it was right after the K-Summit Discuss thread, and I said, well, when do you think, what should I do? When I'm trying to get a company to release the source code, the GPL says correctly that they should release, that they're choosing not to. They keep refusing, and they refuse. And they stall, and they hire a new lawyer and another lawyer and another lawyer to try and stonewall us. What should I do? And Greg said, you should walk away and let them violate the GPL. That's the point where Greg and I disagree. From my point of view, once the community knows that that's the case, that if you just stonewall and refuse to do what the GPL says you're supposed to do, then it doesn't really work as a license. We might as well relicense everything under 2-clause BSD because that's what 2-clause BSD says. You attribute the work, give the person credit, and you can make as much proprietary software with it as you like and never have to give anybody any source code. But if we treat the bad actors as the winners and say, well, a good actor who upstreams, they're just a good actor in the community, and the bad actors get away with it. That, I think, basically denies what the license structure was set up for. It's also funny to me that there's this obsession with as if lawsuits are frequent and disruptive. If you look on the places where you can look up lawsuits on various different databases, you'll find that most tech companies are suing each other all the time in one court or another over a myriad of different topics. There's probably hundreds of lawsuits between companies every year. Just if you pick any set of tech companies, they probably sued each other 100 times in a year. If we overcount, if we try to count sort of every possible legal action of GPL enforcement history, I tried to count and I got to about 50 of ever being brought in the history of the GPL at all. And that's over a 30-year period. So it's sort of silly that we tolerate tech companies disruptively suing each other over patents and everything else all the time. And the message back from those very companies is, well, when you disrupt our Linux space with the occasional GPL lawsuit, that we can't tolerate. That to me just doesn't seem like a politically viable argument, but doesn't seem like a genuine argument. It's just a political attack on those of us who want to keep software free. So, Conservancy, where I work, we've done exactly one Linux lawsuit. It wasn't even our lawsuit, it was Christoph Hellwig brought lawsuit against VMware because VMware's product, as it turned out, the ESXi product, actually has absolutely no ability to talk to a disk or a network without Linux code. If you remove all the Linux pieces that they incorporated into their kernel and reboot it, it boots up, but then can't do anything more because it can't talk to a network and it can't talk to a disk. In fact, the entire SCSI subsystem was the SCSI subsystem that Christoph Hellwig wrote, and there's an analysis on our website if you want to see more of those technical details. VMware actually knew what they were doing. It's not the case, which 15 years ago, most GPL violators, they were just making a mistake. They just didn't understand. They were just confused about what the license said. VMware made a conscious decision to try to circumvent the GPL. When they were caught, they stonewalled, they refused to comply. Conservancy, we spent 3 years negotiating with them, trying to get them into compliance. Christoph spent a whole nother year on his own trying to get them to comply with the license, and only then did Christoph seek legal action. That case is currently on appeal in Germany because the first court basically said they couldn't figure out how to decide the case because they'd never seen a case about the GPL in this way before, and they were seems to me pretty nervous about the international attention the case received, so they happily made a weird decision and let it go to a higher court, which is now going to consider it on appeal. It's not a surprise that that huge fight in the case I'm going to discuss mailing list happened just a few months after Christoph's case was put forward to appeal. So there is a lot of rancor about this question, but historically it was part of our community, so I don't see a downside to it. The key thing that we've heard is that Conservancy cares more about copyleft as some sort of policy agenda than Linux itself. I don't want to sacrifice Linux for the sake of GPL. The GPL, as I said in my talk 2 years ago, is merely a tool to get a job done. If it was a bad tool, if it was a tool that didn't work, I would be the first to say we should get rid of it. But it's a tool that's done a lot of great things for us to get source code released. So I want to fight for the users of Linux devices. What I see now is that there is, I'm going to make that stop for a second. So what I see now is that there are lots and lots of people getting copies of Linux that they don't get the freedoms that I got when I got the first copy of Linux in 1992 that I ran. I see a lot of people getting devices that they can't rebuild from source. And that's the thing that I want to stop. Ultimately, licenses and code are ephemeral things. Linux may someday be replaced by something else. Every GPL program that matters today may someday be replaced by something else. I care most about what happens to users long term. And I want to see them get a certain amount of software freedom when they get copies of code. So I want to build a community that is the same community that made OpenWrt happen. What I've watched happen in this community over the 20 years I've been following it, or 15 years I've been following it since it started, is that you all get together and make it work on new devices when they come out. Because you like to take them apart, figure out how they work, and get your firmware onto them. We need that kind of community everywhere. And the wireless router world is the only place we've got a foothold. The fact of the matter is, if you look at most Android devices, if you look at televisions, it's almost hopeless to get your own firmware running on those devices, even though the GPL says that you should be allowed to. So, in a way, the whole wireless router thing has been a canary in the coal mine from the beginning. It was the first real embedded use of Linux in a real way. And it was the first time that companies said, Linux is such an essential component of this operation that we can't live without it. We'll just have to figure out how to deal with this GPL thing. Some of them decided to work upstream. Some of them decided to get away with violating. Some of them just went full steam ahead and didn't pay attention to what their obligations were. I think on the last one, we've done a lot of great work to educate them. But there are still bad actors out there. And as IoT becomes a bigger thing, there are going to be more and more devices that are following what happened in the wireless router market. And I think the only way we can deal with it is enforce the GPL. So my question to all of you is whether the wireless router market should be a beachhead. I think it's very interesting that while GPL enforcement has been such an essential part of OpenWrt, I suspect that it doesn't impact your lives day to day. It probably impacts the larger Linux community more than it impacts you, because the larger Linux community is somewhat regularly debating the issue, bringing it up. Companies that support Linux heavily with large amounts of development time have strong opinions about GPL enforcement. They work hard to make it stop happening and put financial resources behind it. But that doesn't seem to happen in this community. And the companies that operate close in the OpenWrt community, I do not think, unless it's changed in recent years, are opposed to the idea of GPL compliance or opposed to the idea of seeing GPL enforced. I think companies in this community understand the fundamental point, which is if they're doing the right thing with regard to GPL, they're making sure the source code is available, they're making sure that people can upgrade firmwares, that a competitor who fails to do that is basically able to undercut them. Because there's no question that GPL compliance has a cost associated with it. It's not technically trivial to make sure when you ship a device that it complies with GPL. So companies that do the right thing bear that technical burden, and companies that circumvent the requirements don't, and therefore save money. So the question I have is whether or not we should look at OpenWrt as a place. Should we return to the era that Harold created, which I think in some ways, in my point of view, of course this is the space that I work in, was a bit of a golden age of actually getting serious responses out of companies that were failing to comply with the GPL. But I do this not because I love it. It's mainly that I hate it, but I see it as necessary. So I think if we were going to do that, what we'd want is OpenWrt developers to want it to happen. That's an open question. I don't know whether you all want to enter the fray again of making sure GPL compliance happens. I see it on your web forums. I did a little research and saw that there are still people complaining about wireless vendors who don't, even some who are based on OpenWrt, who don't get the source code. And they even say in there, well, I reported this to Conservancy, and Conservancy said they wouldn't take care of it. And the reason we said we wouldn't take care of it is because we have such a long queue and we don't know when we'll get to a particular violation. And it's easier for us to work on violations when we have collaborators in the community that want us to get it done. There's a political viability question for us, that if developers in the community are not engaged in our efforts, it's tougher for us to do anything about a particular GPL violation. I think there were people in the OpenWrt community who felt strongly about this issue and wanted to work to assure that those cases where router manufacturers were not complying with the GPL, to help us get them there, which is primarily an education process, but not a fun one, often. I think that would make a difference for whether we do it. And we want to plan with you as a community to see if you wanted to do this. As I said, I don't like doing this job. It's actually pretty boring. It's not a major part of what Conservancy does, and it's become substantially less a part of what we do because of the political opposition that I explained from the Linux community. It's also really boring. Educating people through long phone calls and conversations, how to meet their obligations on the GPL, is not a fun job to do. And there's a lot of political danger in engaging in GPL enforcement, political danger that wasn't there when Harold was doing it, that's been created by companies that would basically like to see the GPL go away, and they're pretty well resourced. So if I could, I would rather be a developer myself. But I keep talking about GPL enforcement, I keep trying to help with it when I can. Conservancy as an organization tries to do it because there's a benefit to developers and users when source code's available, and the full source code's available and it installs correctly. So what I'm really asking is, if your users are complaining, which they seem to be, about continued GPL violations, which are no longer the norm, but I think in the general case these days they would tend to be by bad actors as opposed to by uneducated actors. That doesn't surprise me that that's what's happening. And if we dug and we started looking around at the wireless router market in more detail, we'd probably find that there were more GPL violations. But I'm here for the next day and a half to find out from you if you want to do something about this, or if you don't. It's really not up to me, nor should it be. And I don't feel that I want to continue doing GPL enforcement work if I don't have a large coalition of developers behind Conservancy's efforts. So what I want to hear from you, in the hallways track and so forth, is if you feel that there are still places where your work's being blocked by various router manufacturers who don't comply with the GPL, and B, if you want to work with us to do something about it. That's what I want to find out from you all. So with that, if I still have time for questions, I may have taken my question time, but if I do, if I haven't, I'll take some. This is my
Mirko, are you in the room? Oh, he's in the back of the room. Okay. I just want to tell you that I'm going to, because there's no workshop in parallel with mine, while we have the next 2 lightning talks, I'm going to go get my slides to get to these guys, and then I'll do an overview presentation in this room as the last lightning talk, and then we'll do the 5-minute lightning talks tomorrow, and Mirko's going to do all these questions.
I now have to ask a lot of intelligent questions. That's never happened before. Okay, let me go.
Hey, thank you for the talk. My question is, let's say many of us, all of us want to support the process, but we don't want to go full throttle into sending cease and desist lawsuits to everyone. Is there a progressive way to approach the fighting for the GPL? There you go.
Yeah. I mean that is part of what we published in these principles. I'm getting back to these principles. So they run off the page. There's 2 more that are on the website. But the whole idea is that legal action is always a last resort. It's kind of been amazing to me that there's been this perception created that somehow there's tons of lawsuits always going on. There haven't been that many, nor do I think there need to be tons of lawsuits ever. I think that unless you're willing to tell a company, if you don't do what needs to be done, that is a possibility on the other end of this process, that in my experience, they won't comply, at least the bad actors. It's very easy at this point, to educate good actors, right? Because your community already is doing that process, because you're welcoming contributors who are companies to contribute to OpenWrt upstream. You're encouraging them to install it as a default firmware on their routers. You're helping them do that. In all those cases, that's basically compliance education in itself. The real issue and the stuff that I tend to work on is the cases where that fails, where a company comes in and says, in the OpenWrt case, I can just use all this stuff and I don't have to deal with the details. And that, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. You want to say more, so please do.
My question then is, what do you need from us? Like concrete things. I saw support, like money-wise. Can we sign the things that you send, or can we ask you to come with us to someone that is not behaving? Or
right. So if the OpenWrt community wanted to refresh a commitment in GPL enforcement, I think it would take basically 3 prongs. One would be to join our coalition of Linux developers, which is link on our website, and that's agreement you signed to allow us to act on your behalf as a copyright holder. But a lot of people, we've been doing that, and many people in this room have signed those agreements. The problem is we don't have the help that we need from the community. It's not financial, it's technical and engagement. So you all know better who the problems are in your community, which wireless router manufacturers need to be identified, which ones to prioritize. We take reports from the general public and we get the emails in, and people say, well, this manufacturer or another doesn't comply with the GPL. There are so many of those, we don't want to waste our time, right? We don't want to pick a wireless router manufacturer who's not going to be around next month anyway. Like, okay, they violated GPL for a month and went out of business. I don't really care. But the ones that are long-term problems, we'd want to deal with you, and then we need we need to offer them the same kind of sort of hand-holding that you offer people coming into your community, because we start every GPL enforcement action assuming that they want to comply, assuming that they want to become a contributor. So we need developers in the community that want to do that work, which is painstaking work to do that kind of education. I think the community benefits from it, but we need volunteers and people who wanted to do that. So those are the kind of 3 things that I'm here to talk to you about.
Do we have other questions?
Yeah, he wants to ask me about GPL v3 and GPL v2. I suspect.
No, that was not the intention.
I'll talk about it later.
Yes.
No, I heard you ask
But
that.
basically, if you look what is written, it doesn't oblige anybody to explain how to install the firmware. What is written is a little bit different, and this is one of the problems. And this is why there is a GPL v3, by the way.
I don't think so.
And scripts used to control installation of the executable.
Right.
So
Okay.
depending on the way you produce your boxes, you can deliver that and it will not mean that the end user will know how to install it.
The intent's clear, that you're supposed to have the information to be able to install. It is true that it does not talk about...
No, it's not that he must be able to install. You must deliver the scripts used to install. It's different.
Okay, so give me...
And this is why there is GPL v3 too.
No,
okay?
that's you
That's
did
one
what
of the reasons. But this is not my point. My point was because, basically, I agree that enforcement makes sense. However, given the legal mess that the way the license was defined generates, my suggestion would be to choose the battles, okay? When you say that it's about, the compliance. The compliance may have different aspects, and my suggestion would be maybe to concentrate on some non-compliance types and not on all of them. Because, if there is a need of support from a community, it's much easier to say that there is a firmware that is based on OpenWrt and the manufacturer doesn't deliver the source code as the license obliges him. This is a kind of easy and straightforward case. And there, because of the way that the license is written, you can imagine huge legal battles to prove that something is wrong or not. And nobody will spend its time on that, especially given that you have many simpler cases, etc. So my suggestion would be to choose the battles. If not, you can spend a lot of time and at the end not be sure that you will win. And it would depend on the country, etc., etc.
I agree with most of what you said. I think that there's two important points there. One is you need to pick cases where it's going to benefit the community the most, right? And it may turn out that you're correct, and this is why I want feedback from OpenWrt developers. It may turn out that the only ones that will benefit the community are ones where you say where they're easy to fix because they're already using OpenWrt.